Good evening, everybody. It's really good to see so many people here and to see a full auditorium. It's great to have so many people who are here for this evening's lecture. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Deborah Smith. I'm at the moment Acting Deputy Vice-Chancellor, but my real day job is Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research, which is my passion. And I'm really delighted to be here this evening to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Jonathan Haskel, to give the 2019 Dixon lecture. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event tonight, the 2019 Ken Dixon lecture, which is entitled Capitalism Without Capital, Understanding the New Knowledge Economy. So this is given this year by our invited speaker, who we're really looking forward to hearing, Professor Jonathan Haskel. And we're really delighted he's here. After his talk, he's going to be asking and answering some questions, and then he'll be signing books in the auditorium, I think, afterwards. So we look forward to that. Here at York, we have one of the largest economic departments in the UK, offering a great diversity of research expertise and research-led teaching. We aim to challenge and to excite our students about economics, and perhaps there could be no more important time to be driving this endeavour. Over the last 16 years, this lecture series, hosted by the Department of Economics and Related Studies, has attracted distinguished speakers to debate on economic issues of the day. This wonderful series is made possible thanks to the generous support from Ken Dixon, in whose honour the lecture is named. Ken, who unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, is a former chair of the Council of the University and a distinguished honorary graduate. Our speaker this evening, Jonathan Haskel, is Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School in London and previously taught at the University of London, the University of Bristol and the London Business School, as well as in the USA and Australia. He's also a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. As a member of that committee, Jonathan's role is to assess the economic prospects for the UK and to vote on policy around interest rates and quantitative easing in order to ensure low and stable inflation, a very important factor for us all to consider. Monetary stability supports long-term decision-making on investment and spending by all organisations, from governments to companies to households. This links to Jonathan's academic interest in productivity, innovation, intangible investment and growth. He is the author, with Stian Westlake, of Capitalism Without Capital, The Rise of the Intangible Economy. We're thrilled to present such an interesting speaker this evening, but before we begin, I've got great pleasure in introducing Juliet Healy from the Bank of England in Yorkshire to briefly tell us a little about their role before we welcome Professor Haskel. Juliet, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to meet you all. My name is Juliet Healy and I'm the Bank of England agent for Yorkshire. Now, I imagine a lot of you in the room are thinking, what's a Bank of England agent? And I thought they were all based in London. Well, most of our staff are based in London, but we have agents across the UK. We have a network of 12, and our job is to be the ears, eyes and voice of the Bank of England across the UK. We spend a lot of our time talking to businesses, all sizes, all sectors, to find out how they are seeing the economy evolve. So we talk about what they're seeing today, what their plans are, how their marketplace is changing, and we feed all of that intelligence into the policymakers, into people like Jonathan. Our role is essentially to make sure that the policymakers in head office understand how the economy is really working and how it's evolving, not just the theory and not just what the survey data and the official data are telling them. Now, we also do lots of other things as well. We talk to charities, third sector, we do talks and speeches, and the Bank of England is doing more and more across the UK. One of the things we're doing is we've got an education programme. So if any of you are involved in schools, you can sign up on our website, have a look at materials that we provide. We will also come out and speak. That might be a local agent, but it also might be somebody from head office. So if you're interested, please do have a look at that on the website. We're also doing a bit more to try and directly talk to the general public, to consumers, to households. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because at the moment we rely on a lot of survey information and we don't have a lot of direct interaction. So we've set up something called citizens panels and we're running those across all of the regions in the UK. And again, you can have a look at those on the website, and if you're interested, sign up. We've had one in Hull and we're due to have one in Leeds in the autumn. So if you're interested in the Bank of England, we've got a comprehensive website. If you fancy coming and trying to be recruited, we're always on the lookout for good economists, but also good thinkers, just independent thinkers, people who can challenge the orthodoxy. They're always very, very welcome at the Bank of England. So check out our recruitment site, and as I say, we've got an education programme people can access, and we're out and about in the regions. So, without further ado, I would like to hand over to your guest speaker for tonight, Jonathan Haskel. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you all very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before I start, I should say thank you all for coming, and thank you to Mr. Ken Dixon for kindly sponsoring this lecture series. Now, as I understand it, Ken has a very significant birthday this year. So if it's a significant birthday, I thought to myself, I must get him a significant present. So I walked down to the Bank of England vaults. Those of you who know the Bank of England will know that we've got about £100 billion worth of gold in the Bank of England vaults, because I need to get a present, and I asked them. I thought they wouldn't miss all of that much. But unfortunately, they weren't that willing to let me have too much of the gold. So instead, I've got some gold chocolate. It kind of looks like gold. So I'm going to entrust this to Deborah. So you're not allowed to eat it whilst this. If this talk goes on for a really long time, then Deborah can hand around the chocolate for us so we can all kind of keep going. Thank you again all very much indeed for coming out. I want to talk about Capitalism Without Capital. This is a book we've tried to write, book we've written, and it's an attempt to try to describe some features of the economy which hopefully will play a part in my new day job, which is working, as Deborah kindly said, at the Bank of England. But the book we've tried to do is an attempt to be very accessible to non-economists. So I hope that will suit most people in the room. Right, what is it that we're trying to do? Well, us economists are put on Earth in order to figure out what the social problems are in the world today, and there appear to be quite a host of them. Let's have a look and see what some of them might be, and see whether understanding the structure of the economy might help us figure some of this stuff out. So one big crisis at the moment in America seems to be around long-term growth. This pointer doesn't work, so I'm going to point physically here. Long-term growth seems to have slowed in America and quite a lot of countries around the world. And so we asked the question, why is productivity investment low? And here's the point, profits seem to be high and technology seems to be abundant. So if you go to the kind of work that Deborah's doing, and the kind of work the University of York is doing, come to that, which is attempting to bring technology and have technological relationships with other companies. There seems to be a lot of that around. Profit rates seem to be high, so why is it that investment seems to be low and productivity not forthcoming? Inequality is a very big concern. I know many people in the economics department here are working on these types of issues. Why is the gap between the rich and the poor grown so much? We'd like to understand that as well. And then a subject close to my heart, at least from the bank's point of view, which is the allegation that the financial system is not doing a good job in backing, in some sense, the real economy. I know it's a complaint. We go around talking to industrialists with the bank team up here. That's a complaint that they often have. And then finally, you have a picture of Mr. Trump in every talk, of course. A growing gulf between the liberal citadels and left behind places, particularly kind of on the regional side. Lots of discussion about that around the American elections and around the Brexit types of discussion around here. Now, of course, some people might take the view that fundamentally what's the problem is capitalism itself. Right? And there are significant individuals in significant political parties who will tell you that is the problem. Our view is instead that capitalism is changing in a particular way towards a more intangible type of the economy. I'll explain that in just a second. That's a more helpful way of thinking about some of our problems. So what I'm going to try to talk about tonight in the next half an hour is something about the rise of the intangible economy, and I'm going to have a little bit to say about York itself as well. Why is intangible capital different? And finally, what does this mean for business and the economy and for policy? So let's start with the rise of the intangible economy. So the core of our book and the core of what I think is important in understanding the economy is basically on this screen. So you can fall asleep for the rest of the lecture, but you have to pay attention, I'm afraid, to this screen because this is kind of the whole thing. It is that the nature of investment and capital assets in this country, and indeed in many countries, is changing very significantly. Here on the left-hand side are the types of tangible investments that many people will be familiar with and that are counted in national accounts and in company accounts. And here they all are: buildings, so the one we're in at the moment, computers, the thing that we're using at the front, plant machinery, and vehicles. We were at Hawley earlier on, talking to them about their Brexit business and so on and so forth. So those very tangible types of investment, those traditional types of investments, accountants know how to count this stuff up. National income accountants who are responsible for counting GDP know how to put it all in GDP. However, the case in our book is that the economy is changing and there's much more investment going on in these intangible investments. Now, by the intangible investments, what I mean is investments which produce some kind of asset which you can't touch or feel, right? So you can touch and feel all these types of things on the left-hand side, not so much on the right-hand side. Let me walk you through these types of assets on the right-hand side here so that we're all on the same page about what we mean. So an obvious one, which will be familiar to many people who use this university, is R&D. Inventing some chemical formula, inventing some pharmaceutical drug, something like that. It's an intangible asset, something incredibly useful for firms, not something that you can touch and feel. So there's an obvious source of investment which has been rising steadily over the years. Training would be another form of intangible asset. Many, many firms, banks for example, spend enormous amounts of money training their staff. This is an important asset for firms, assuming the staff stay. So that's another important question. But again, not an asset which is tangible on the left-hand side. Design is another issue as well. If you think, everybody's got a mobile, I'm sure everybody's got a mobile phone in their pocket. Think about the design of a mobile phone, right? An attractive feature of phones, and there's another intangible asset. The fourth one down there is organizational development. Something about how it is that businesses actually function. That would seem to be a very important aspect of modern capitalism. When you go in the US, when you go to Walmart and you go to Kmart and you buy a pair of shoes, it's the same pair of shoes, but somehow or other it feels a bit different in Walmart and in Kmart. Now, brands and marketing. I'll have much more to say about brands and marketing in a little while, but brands and marketing are surely another form of important intangible asset which powers a large number of businesses. Artistic originals, I've got to the bottom there. So there's a picture of Britain's most famous innovation. If you've ever wanted to know where does Harry Potter appear in the national accounts, I can tell you now. Harry Potter is, of course, an intangible investment. The book itself is rather tangible, if you see what I mean, but the ideas which the book kind of encapsulates somehow are not. So that's counted as an investment in the sense that people who are writing a book are building up a durable asset which is going to give them a flow of services in the same way that if you invest in vehicles. So around Harry Potter is, of course, an enormous ecosystem of books, theatre scripts, movie scripts, software, things like that. So again, it touches many of those other types of intangible assets as well. And that takes us to the last, and in some ways possibly the most important intangible asset in the modern IT economy, which is software and databases. So software is an obvious intangible asset. Again, you can kind of look at it if you sort of see what I mean, if you print a piece of a computer program out, but it's the ideas encapsulated in that which seem to be increasingly important. Likewise, databases, and that gets us into concerns of privacy and all those various concerns as well. But if you think about firms like, LinkedIn, firms like Experian who do credit checks when you go along and apply for a credit card and all that sort of thing, these are just firms essentially with enormous databases, and their entire asset is essentially an intangible asset. So that's the core of our ideas, namely that the nature of the economy is changing. Now, that would not be all that interesting if it weren't for the fact that this change is hidden. And it's hidden, I think, in the following type of way. If we think about GDP, first of all, and ask what investments do we count as standard in GDP, so now I'm going to have to go into a little bit of economics speak for the economic students, a load of economic students who I met earlier on, and I see you all sitting at the back, so forgive me if you're not an economic student, but for economic students, do you remember that thing Y equals C plus I plus G? So the I bit, we count those investments, so the question is what do we count as investments when we do all of that? And the answer is that since the 1940s, we've counted these tangible assets as indeed investments, buildings and vehicles and computers and so forth. Over the years, more intangible assets have been added as investments as well. So again, if you were to ask, where does Harry Potter, where does R&D, where does software appear in the national accounts? When people invest in it, it appears as investment, and then they report those investment data, and then that gets into GDP. But there's still a stack of intangible investments like branding and design and training and so forth, which we don't count in GDP. So the first issue around intangible investments from a sort of national income accounting side is we just don't we just don't count much of it. Now, if you think that the national accounts move slowly, they are like skipping kangaroos compared to company accounts. Company accounts move, I mean, if national accounts move glacially, company accounts move, what's slower than glacially? Tectonically, is that right? Deborah's nodding here, so I need a geography person to help me out. So company accounts move tectonically, if that's the right answer, if that's right. And so here's an illustration from Lev and Gu's work, two professors of accounting at New York University. So let me just talk you through this just for a second. This does the following. It says, take all the companies who entered the US stock market, quoted in the stock market, who entered the US stock market, who entered in the 1950s, and ask the question, how much of their market value on the stock market can you explain by their book value, that is to say, by the value of their assets, right? So take those companies, you know, who either entered or had been there, so this is Standard Oil and, not Standard Oil, but oil companies and steel and this, that and the other. And it turns out that if you can see about 85% of, so this is the R-squared in a regression, if you remember your R-squared regressions, about 85% of the variance in the value can be explained by their book value. Now take the companies who entered the US stock market in the 2000s and ask the same question, how much of their book value, of their asset value on the stock market, of their market value on the stock market, I'll get it right in a second, how much of their market value can be explained by the value of stuff on their books? And the answer is about 25%. And you know who those companies are. Those are, you know, the Googles and the LinkedIn's and you know, the modern day companies. And they're deeply, deeply, deeply intangible types of companies. So this tells you on the left that the national accounts are increasingly measuring this intangible stuff. So that's giving us at the bank and elsewhere, as the students of the economy, a clearer, but not entirely clear, read on how the economy is doing. The company accounts seem to be a very long way behind. And that seems to raise a set of kind of serious issues about how it is that we're going to judge companies, especially the high-tech companies, who you'd think about, like Microsoft and so forth, Apple, you know, who've got these vast amounts of intangible assets. Now, you might think then that this whole issue around intangible assets is a study of the kind of technology economy, and maybe we're just talking about the digital economy, and you know, it's just sort of yet another way of approaching and trying to analyse the digital economy. So we talk in the book about an example where that's not the case, just to try to motivate somehow or other that this is important for lots of different businesses. And the example that we have in mind, what we start with is by going to the gym. So if you start by going to the gym, we start in 1977. So 1977 is a very important year in the history of gyms because that was the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger's first movie came out, Pumping Iron. That was a big, situated in Gold's Gym, as you can see. That was a big issue in, you know, around gyms and health and bodybuilding and all this, that and the other. And if you look at the gym in 1977, you can see plenty of tangible assets there, right? So the building they're in, that's one of the tangible assets. Remember those pictures that we saw a second ago? And then the machines that they're using, there's another tangible asset as well. Now, if you go to the gym in the current era, you might say, well, it looks exactly the same. You might say, hold on a moment, this just looks precisely the same. We've got buildings, we've got lots of equipment and so forth. Actually, it turns out there's tons of intangible assets in gyms as well. So let me explain. Well, let me click on one more slide. Does anybody know the high-intensity exercise body pump? This is a fit and healthy-looking audience, I've got to say. Lots of people are nodding that they all know body pumps. In case, for the very small number of you who don't know what body pump is, so body pump is you all turn up at the gym and there's music playing, you know, thumping music playing, and you jump up and down and lift weights and all. It's great fun and all that kind of stuff. There's an instructor at the front who tells you what to do, and it's a really good way of getting fit. This is an enormous business. This is a huge, huge business throughout all the gyms. It's run by a company called Les Mills. Les Mills was a New Zealand Olympian in the 1960s who decided that this training and this getting healthy was kind of an important thing, and people wanted to do this. And his son took over the company, and it's an entirely intangible business. What do I mean by that? What they do is they negotiate the rights to broadcast the music, so that's an intangible asset, right? That's quite a complicated thing. They then send all the music down the line and in encrypted software and so forth, so there's a software element to it as well. They then have to train the people who stand at the front and give you instructions as to what to do and all of that. They need to be trained, and there's a way that they get trained, and they get examined over the internet and this, that, and the other. So there's training and so forth going on as well. And then there's lots of branding and marketing that goes on as well. If you look at Google, and if you look at people who stop their gym membership, the most popular reason why people stop their gym membership is that the gyms are stopping offering this body pump exercise. Okay, so again, it's just a pure intangible business. Les Mills, don't own any gyms whatsoever, so they don't own any buildings. That's the tangible bit. So there's no tangible aspect of what they do. And they don't own any of the complicated machines and this, that, and the other either. Again, so there's no tangible aspect of all that. It's an entirely intangible element. Now, in case that example wasn't enough, where I say intangibles everywhere, intangibles are, of course, particularly important here in York. So here's an example of a tangible asset in York from 1906, which was one of the, I think it's the earliest Rowntree factory. I think it was an earlier one, but this is one of the ones in York. So you might say, well, hold on a moment, isn't that just very tangible? That looks like a building, chocolate factory, building up. Well, of course, what Rowntrees are all about is they're all about intangible assets. So Kit Kat, right, seems like a well-known brand. If I came up with some form of chocolate with, with the wafers and the bars and this, that, and the other, but called it something else, I don't think I'd go very far with it. Smarties is from 1937, so another incredibly well-known brand. That seems like another intangible asset. After 8 in 1962, and of course I had to mention, now I'm in York, Yorkie bars in 1976. And the person who, of course, was responsible for all of this stuff is the gentleman who was made CEO, that's Ken Dixon, who kindly sponsors these lectures, and he was made CEO in 1981. And if you read the history of Rowntree, a lot of it is arguments essentially about the value of these different brands. And so when Nestle took over Rowntree, I forget when it was, a decade or so ago, they paid way over the book value of the factory, right? They paid much more than that, and they paid for all the brands. So kind of an encapsulation, essentially, of how important intangibles have been, certainly for the Rowntree business over all these years. Now, those are early examples of intangibles. So what I wanted to put up is just to give you a sense of over history how this intangible investment has been changing. And this draws on some research work that I've been doing with some colleagues, which essentially tries to go behind the national accounts, because it's rather difficult to get this stuff from the national accounts, and figure out what all these intangibles are. So let's start with this on the left-hand side here. This tells you the following. This gives you investment as a share of GDP. So those numbers on the left-hand side, in case you can't see them, start at around 11-12%, where those first few lines are. And the red line tells you about the tangible investment as a share of GDP. So this says for every pound of GDP, how much a company's spending on buildings and vehicles and this and that. And you can see that it was around 12%, and then it fell to around 10% in the financial crisis. It fell by quite a lot, and then it recovered slightly, but not all that much. That's the red line. The blue line says how much a company is investing in intangible investment, the software and the databases and the Harry Potter and all the stuff that I was talking about earlier on, the design and all that kind of thing. And you can see that there's an overtaking point. So this is the US and Europe. There's an overtaking point around about the 2000s, and that blue line has been going up since then. So if you try to do a bit of detective work, as I say, and uncover all of this, what you find is that intangible investment actually overtook tangible investment around that time, at least in developed countries, in these developed countries which we have here. There's a longer-term trend exemplified in this graph from the US since the 1940s. So you can see that, the equivalent of Rowntree's were doing all that stuff in the 1940s. And you can see that longer trend there. You can see the overtaking was earlier on. If you then unpack the graph on the left I just showed you to give you Europe and the US, you see something kind of interesting. Let's start with the US over on the right-hand side. So again, the blue line is the intangible share, which greatly exceeds the tangible share. So in the US, the predominance of investment is in intangible investment. Europe, the blue line does exceed the red line, but you can see overall Europe is doing less intangible investment, and that's kind of what you'd think. Namely, there's more intangible intensive companies over in the US, the Googles and the LinkedIn and so forth. And so rather grand, I've got a box here about intangible capital as the capital of the 21st century. Everybody's writing books with the word capitalism and capital in them and so forth. So this is our little pitch for all of that. Okay, so that was to try to convince you that there's something interesting about the rise of this. I want to say something about why intangible capital is different, and then say what does this mean for business and the economy. So let me start on why intangible capital is different. You might say, well, this is all very well, but the nature of investment changes all the time. If we were, coming to a talk here in the 1860s, we'd be talking about investment in canals, and then we had investment in railways, and then we had investment after railways in roads, because they invented roads, and then we had investment in airports, and you might just say, and now we invest in high-speed fibre, broadband and all that. So you might say, just investment has changed all the time, so it's not very interesting, just to cite that there have been all these changes. Well, we think that what's interesting about intangible investment is it's got some interesting economic properties from which some then interesting economic consequences flow. So let me tell you about those economic properties. There are 4 of them. They all begin with S, so in the exam after this lecture you'll be able to remember what they are. I'll tell you them quickly and then I'll explain what they mean. So the first is scale. These intangibles are rather scalable. The second is kind of slightly economicsy thing. They're sunk. Once they're made, they're hard to get back. The third is there are spillovers. If I do some investment, other people might benefit. And the fourth is there are synergies. If I combine them together, they're especially valuable. So let me walk through some of these properties. I'm sorry to do that rather fast. Let me walk through some of these properties. Excuse me. and bring out some of these issues. So let's start with scale. So here's a picture of Addison Lee Cabs, a big cab company, at least in London. They've got these very tangible assets, namely their cabs. If Addison Lee want to carry another passenger, they've got to basically order another cab. Here's a rather different cab company over on the right here. If they want to carry another passenger, well, they can just use exactly the same algorithm. So the first property of intangibles, like software, for example, is that it's scalable in a way that the tangible assets are not. So that's about scalable, as it says here. They can be used over and over in multiple places with little or no reinvestment. So that's the first thing. Now, I mentioned this word sunkenness, so this is sort of slightly economicsy, so the non-economists, let me see if I can understand explain what's going on here. If you think back to Nokia, who used to be, if you're old enough to remember Nokia, they were the dominant telephone company. They had 70% of the market. If we were having this seminar, if we were having this lecture, 10, 15 years ago, everybody would have a Nokia phone on them. Nobody had ever heard of Apple. It was just all Nokia. When Nokia unfortunately went bankrupt, they basically had 2 assets. The first asset was a tangible asset, and it's over on the left-hand side. it's their company headquarters in Finland, which is still there. They sold it, and it's been sold to various other places, and it's now a whole group of Finnish startups. It's quite an exciting place, as a matter of fact. And maybe one of them will become, the next Nokia or the next Apple or Microsoft and so forth. So they had these tangible assets. They were able to sell off those tangible assets, and like I say, they're still in operation. They had another type of assets. You'll not be surprised to know they were the intangible assets, and it was the Symbian operating system, which became, when they were sold to Windows, the Windows mobile system. That essentially never worked. It was written off by Microsoft at a cost of $5 billion. Now, $5 billion here, $5 billion, I mean, I know to the Bank of England, $5 billion is like rounding error. But, to real companies, $5 billion is really quite a lot of money. And here's the point. Many of these intangible assets are sunk, which is to say, all the money that Nokia spent building Symbian, which was the dominant operating system at the time, they couldn't get it back. On the other hand, the money they could get back was the buildings and so forth, they could get back. So that's the second feature of intangible assets. Third feature of intangible assets is spillovers. So if I build a factory and somebody else wants to use my machine, I just put a security guard outside there. Nobody else can use my machine. That's it. There are no spillovers from my tangible investment to anybody else. Now, what about intangible investments? Let's take the example of design. So here's the iPhone, the very first iPhone in 2007. So since we're on a kind of slight memory trip, those of you who had a mobile phone before that, if you just try to remember what mobile phones looked like before the iPhone, they all looked pretty weird, right? They had bizarre keyboards and funny aerials sticking out, and they kind of folded out in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Basically, within 18 months of the iPhone, every mobile phone looked just like the iPhone. So they were over on the right-hand side, right? And now every mobile phone, every smartphone looked just like the iPhone. So that's an example of what economists call a spillover, which is to say the design of the iPhone is something which everybody else could benefit from. Right? It's spilled over to everybody else. That's the sort of third property. And the fourth property is synergies, putting these intangibles together. Let me say something about the Epipen. So the Epipen, everybody familiar with the Epipen? So the Epipen, I mean, a life-saving invention. If people have anaphylactic shocks, you can give them an injection and it's got the chemicals in it. I mean, as I say, literally a life-saving invention. A very profitable invention from Milan, who own it, $1.2 billion in profits in 2015, for example. And you might think, well, it's not a big surprise. It's got to be profitable because we know about pharmaceuticals. Many pharmaceuticals have got patents, and the whole point about patents is to preserve companies from spillovers, the type of spillovers we just saw. So you might say it's not a big surprise that this is very profitable. Well, there is indeed a patent behind the drugs which underline the Epipen, but the patent ran out about 95 years ago. So there's the patent there. So it's true that part of it is an intangible asset, but it can't just be the patent. So what we think it is it's the sort of network of intangibles that surround the Epipen. So what do I mean by those? So the Epipen has got a very clever design, and it's all very easy to use, especially in an emergency situation. Lots of branding. I mean, you say Epipen, everybody, if I said the chemical, nobody would know the chemical. If I say Epipen, everybody knows what the chemical is. Clever marketing and distribution, and lots of training and so forth as well, which is done in order to improve the sales and the networking of the Epipen. So those are the four properties of intangibles. And what we then ask is what all this means for business and society in terms of the properties. So if you'll forgive me, let me just take you through a couple of issues, and then I promise I'll stop. So two things I wanted to talk about tonight, and I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about other things as well. Leaders and laggards and inequality. So what do I mean by leaders and laggards? There's lots of work done by the OECD who've documented a whole series of graphs which look like this. You calculate productivity for a large number of firms. These are European firms using accounting data. And you break the firms out into the frontier firms and the laggard firms, the most productive firms and the laggard firms. And you see basically the picture on the left. Now, this happens to be data for manufacturing, but you see a similar picture for services, which is a steady divergence between the leading firms and the laggard firms. Right? The frontier firms seem to be getting further and further away from the laggard firms. And that's generally viewed by economists as being something which is quite surprising, because typically we think the laggard firms catch up to the leading firms. Right? So, and part of this is it drives income inequality. So here's a question for the students in the audience. When you leave the University of York and you go get a job, who would you like to work for? The leading firms or the laggard firms? Well, probably many people would like to vote for the leading firms. So that may be a fuel of that income inequality. And then you could happen, as I hinted at just before, why is this happening? So people say, well, maybe technology is not diffusing very well. Maybe these laggard firms kind of haven't got the memo yet that there's computers and stuff like that out there. They could do a better job. Kind of seems unlikely. Maybe the competition authorities are falling down on the job. So we think part of the answer is to do with intangibles. So let's go through some of these S's and see how that relates. So the first is scalability. So here's Bob's Taxis on the left versus Uber. Bob's Taxis find it difficult to scale up. Uber can scale up enormously. Here's your local cafe. They find that hard to scale up, but this particular cafe find it very easy to scale up. So maybe what the leading firms are doing is they're using their intangible assets to scale up enormously, and so they're just, that's the cause of why they're the leading firms. Second, around spillovers. So there's a series of books around, in the innovation studies kind of management literature, which try to look at the idea around the spillovers that I just described, that if I invent something, other people can take that invention on. Maybe those leading firms are just getting much better at absorbing those spillovers and taking those inventions on. And thirdly, around synergies. So here's a group of intangibles, bits of software, Snapchat, Instagram, this, that, and the other, all of which Facebook has either acquired or tried to acquire. So maybe once these frontier firms get the intangibles, or that already have value intangibles, as it says here, they can get greater benefits from other intangibles as well. So those might be three reasons why it is, as I say, that these leader firms are pulling away from the laggard firms. Quickly on inequality, one thing about intangible assets is they tend to be contested. So up on the left here is a very early law code, the law code of Ur-Nammu, which is in the Middle East, and it's written on tablets of stone. And this is from 2100 BC, 2100 BC, sorry. And it describes the ownership of fields, houses, and animals. So my co-author, Stephen Westlake, is a historian. If we've had, I don't know, 3,000 years of figuring out the ownership of things like fields, houses, and animals, that for historians is a reasonably long time, and that's not quite, so that's reasonably settled. Here's an early intangible law code, the Statute of Queen Anne, codification of intangible property around copyright. That took 3,500 years, and it's been only going since about 300 years. So again, my co-author will tell you, as any historian will tell you, that 300 years is a short period of time. And so the contesting of intangible assets, we're still trying to figure out who owns what. So for example, when Monarch Airlines went bankrupt, not last year, the year before, it was perfectly clear who owned their aircraft, and that was all sorted out. It was very unclear who owned their biggest intangible asset, which was their landing slots at Gatwick and Luton. It took ages to sort of figure all that out. So the codification of intangibles is difficult. Now, that then takes you to a bit of careers advice, which is this. Maybe the people who are going to be really successful in the intangible economy are the people who can make some sense of this contestedness. Who might they be? So they might be heroic entrepreneurs. They might be people who are politically connected. So this is Nellie Krauss, who was a minister in Europe, now working for Uber. What Robert Wright called symbolic analysts, people who sort of put things together in firms, and a series of business leaders. There's Jerry Stambo and various other places, and Bezos and Steve Jobs as well. Maybe those types of people who can put intangibles together and manage those kinds of things are going to do particularly well in the intangible economy. There's also going to be an effect, we think, around cities. So this just is the last thing I wanted to talk about. If you ask the question, where are these spillovers and synergies going to occur? Where geographically are they going to occur? The answer is probably not in average. They're probably more likely to occur in big cities. So, for example, in Canary Wharf, people bump into each other. The sort of the serendipity of these meetings and these types of intangibles are going to take place there. That means that planning restrictions are going to become rather costlier. What do I mean by planning restrictions? So this building in Canary Wharf hasn't been built yet. This is the one at the very front that you could see. And the reason it hasn't been built yet is that when they applied for planning permission, the local residents wanted to keep the incumbent building. And the incumbent building is what you see on the bottom there as well. Now that's fine. We don't want to bulldoze over, the entire world. But it does mean that in the world of intangibles, where people want to be together in these cities, it's going to be more expensive, and that has policy implications as well. This may be a major driver of inequalities. So Thomas Piketty has got this very famous book on capital in the 21st century, and some of the criticisms which have come in particular from some graduate students, this is Matt Rogley, have pointed out that housing wealth seems to be one of the major forces behind Piketty's book. Where's the housing wealth come from? Well, the housing wealth, you might think that's very tangible, but of course the housing wealth is in cities. If everybody is moving to cities to get the intangible benefits, then that forces up the price of tangible assets depending upon restrictions. So there's the connection between the two. It also means that cities become possibly more sectorally diverse. Here's Youngstown, Ohio. Famously, it did steel, and it only did steel, and that's all it ever did. If you look at the share of US patenting by city, you see one city or one area, which is the bold blue area, which is just zooming up there. So for those of you who can't read, that's the Bay Area. And it seems like the share of patenting in the Bay Area has been going up, and leaving other cities behind. Well, you might say, oh, well, that's just all ICT. So if you look at the share of non-ICT patenting, you get something very interesting, which is basically the same pattern. So it's not only ICT patenting, but it's non-ICT patenting as well. Again, the kind of clustering effects of cities. Where does that take you? That takes you to the kinds of tensions that we've seen electorally. So this is a graph, fantastic graph from the New York Times, fantastic visualization, I should say, from the New York Times, who have the areas in the US who voted for Mrs. Clinton rather than Mr. Trump, and you can see where are those areas. They're all predominantly in the kind of urban areas. And so economic divisions between thriving cities and the rest, and there are cultural divisions and so forth as well. Okay, so let me stop just by saying one more thing. You might think that on the basis of having to listen to this, you've found out everything you need to find out and you don't need to buy the book. No. There's loads more in the book. I haven't even mentioned the Beatles. We talk about Brexit. I haven't mentioned Brexit as well. The Doomsday Book, microwave ovens, the invention of breakfast, intangibles and inequality. Well, I said something about that. Pros and cons of IP, so lots of stuff around intellectual property, financing and managing intangible businesses, well, some stuff about management, and some various dilemmas for policymakers. But again, I just wanted to end with the words that, in a sense, Ken Dixon, as I say, kindly sponsors these lecture series, would, I think, recognise quite a lot of the themes in this book. I'd like to thank him for inviting me, and thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. An absolutely intriguing talk, and I'll have to go and buy your book in a minute. Perhaps you'll give us a discount,
Oh, no.
Anyway, I'm quite sure in audience's practice there's going to be some interesting questions. So, colleagues, it's over to you. Who'd like to ask Jonathan a question? I'm in the middle here. Yes, bring the microphone.
Oh, we've got the microphone. Okay, great.
1, 2, thank you. My name is Tepo Muloy. I'm a student at the University of York. Thanks very much for the insightful presentation. Mine is just a simple question. You mentioned that from a national accounts point of view, we might have not fully captured these intangible assets when we account for them in the national accounts. Whilst we also know from a monetary policy point of view, most instruments seek to target the balance sheets of financial institutions and the big banks, etc. So I just wanted to ask, from a monetary policy point of view, are there any implications that from a central banking point of view, the Bank of England is worried about?
Thank you. Shall I respond or to
Yeah, please do. No, let's take that question.
That's a terrific question. Thank you very much. I would have if I'd worked all of that stuff out by now, I would have happily come and talk to you about it. I don't think we've worked all of that out now. What I think is going on is, sorry, just to step back for a second. So this is primarily about the real economy. By the real economy, I mean the kind of the output and the stuff that we're producing. Now, it's the intangible real economy, if you sort of see what I mean, as opposed to the monetary economy, the monetary policy, the monetary economy meaning the amount of money that's in circulation and confidence in the currency and all that kind of thing. So what your very smart question rightly asked is, what's the relationship between those two? How should we think about monetary policy, which in some sense is kind of intangible, in a world of more intangibles? I don't think we've quite worked that out yet, but I think what we're trying to understand is this gives you a rather different picture to the operation of the real economy than if you just didn't bother with intangibles. So it's a different way of probably thinking about productivity and the future productivity growth, and it's certainly a very different way of thinking about investment. So certainly one of the things we do when we do monetary policy is we go around, as Juliet was saying earlier on with the Bank of England teams, we talk to companies and ask them about their investment. And when you say to companies, tell me about your investment, they reach, not surprisingly, for the types of investments which their accountants are telling them about, which is to say the tangible stuff, the buildings and the plant and the equipment. But of course, if they're investing in branding or in training or in new design or software, those aren't the types of investments that companies often think about. So by putting this kind of hat on and viewing this sort of slightly broader form of investment, I think we're going to stand a chance, of getting a different view of investment. And given that investment is very sensitive to the business cycle, as we've learned from lots of people here at the economics department, and given that investment is a kind of an indicator of future confidence, knowing more from companies about where they're really investing, I think could really help monetary policy very substantially.
The gentleman up there.
Nick Bosanquet, formerly from Imperial, now resident in York. Thank you very much, and you're quite right about Rowntree's and the intangibles. That really pushed up the company relative to Cadbury's. It's always been a long way behind before, but you forgot their most important product for the birth rate, and that was black magic.
Right.
And they employed psychologists to layer the chocolates. But the question is, what is going to be the effect on the sort of coming greater competition between Asian economies and Western economies from this intangible? Does it appear from what you said that intangibles depend a lot on culture and language, and that Asian economies are going to have great difficulty competing in those areas compared with the manufacture of objects, which obviously have been very good for them up till now?
Thanks for the question. I had black magic on a slide there, I must say, but I thought I'd put Yorkie on, because I was coming to York, right? So I put Yorkie on there. I couldn't resist not doing that. But thanks, Nick, for the question. So the impact on Asia, well, of course, all economies in the world are spending more and more on the intangible assets. As the Asian economies specialize in manufacturing and Western economies essentially outsource all their manufacturing as well, there's that balance going on as well. Of course, that might change as labour effects change. But you asked quite a very interesting question, I think, about how, as it were, internationally tradable some of these intangibles are. And I don't quite know the answer to that. I mean, I think we need some psychologists and people like that to tell us that. I mean, once, for example, India was opened up, to TV and this, that, and the other, I don't know, American football has proved to be amazingly popular in countries outside America, many Asian countries, Indian countries as well. Harry Potter, has gone kind of all over the world, if you sort of see what I mean. So I'm not sure actually how, whether kind of cultural tastes, if you sort of see what I mean, around these artistic and these intangible assets, how specific they are to particular countries or not. I mean, one thing, the language of computing, of course, seems to me to be entirely in English, as far as I can work out. Is that right? I mean, I think that's more or less right. That's not a great, overly aggressive and seemingly self-confident thing to say. So maybe that's an area where, in fact, that could spread extraordinarily, or really without borders at all, actually, across cultural lines in a very substantial way. But I don't quite know the answer, actually, to how much trade there may or may not be.
One tiny addition to that, as a grandparent, I can assure you that Peter Rabbit
Yes.
which is an amazingly effective intangible asset, together with Mr. McGregor, is British made, but the book is printed in China.
Well, can I say one more thing?
Yes.
We were just visiting earlier on Yorkshire tea. And Yorkshire, you know the thing, all the tea in China? Guess where Yorkshire tea are selling their tea? In China.
That's a nice one, isn't it? One here.
I was just going to ask, I'm not an economy student, I'm a social and political sciences student, mature student. In terms of inequality, is it not still the idea that we're in a neoliberalist, marketized economy, instead of this whole collectivist kind of welfare society that Beveridge put in place? I mean, how is this all going to work with intangible? I mean, I don't know a lot about intangible assets, but how, in order to get rid of inequality, we're going to need to move away from this whole kind of marketized, individual kind of area. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks for the question. In some sense, it's not a question that economists tend to think about all that much. So I mean, it's a good question to pose in that regard. I suppose what I'd say is this: is one thing which I think you might find surprising about this intangible assets notion is that inequality seems to have gone up. And the reason you might find it surprising is, remember I said something about spillovers? Remember, when Apple invented the phone, all the other phones kind of look like Apple. You might think, therefore, that a more intangible economy is a force for equality, because people can benefit from types of design and spillover things and so forth. On the other hand, there are these other forces which I described. Once you become a large company, you can put together the synergies, you can scale up. Those are forces for inequality, see what I mean? And I don't quite know which will win out, it seems to me, because there are these two different forces. It might be that we're just going through a particular phase of the development of capitalism in general, the intangible capitalism in particular, which is where the forces of inequality are pushing us apart, and maybe we're going to have a phase of more equality. It might be that we need more work by the competition authorities to get those spillovers going so that we can kind of bring things together. It's certainly I wouldn't say certainly. I think many economists are worried about if we have a more unequal society, how that then plays out in terms of political developments, and whether there are political changes which are brought about from that, which may or may not be unfriendly to these types of developments. So, as I say, it's not necessarily clear to me that an intangible economy is an unequal economy, but that certainly seems to be how it's working out at the moment.
One in the middle there.
So, my name is Healy. I'm a lecturer in economics, and I'm wondering, so a lot of people are afraid that all these changes that now are coming up are like something completely new, and they've never seen anything, or the world hasn't seen anything like this before. So I'm wondering, taking your initial example when it's about the car industry, right? What was the main asset of Ford in the 1920s? Knowing that if you put a wheel on a car in this way, it takes 2.5 seconds, if you do it the other way, it takes 3.2 seconds. And then they built a factory, and that comes with all the nice property that you point out. So is this something new? Like, do we see something? The only difference that we see, and that is what your like somewhat empiric exercise shows us, is that Ford, if they build up these intangible things, this knowledge about how to organize the processes, but it correlated with something tangible. And now it doesn't do that anymore. It's at least not in the same companies, because in the end, the cars from Uber have to be produced somewhere, and they have to be there, don't they? So how new is this, what we're seeing?
Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to the idea that in some sense there's not that much new about these intangibles, and the Ford example is quite a good example actually of, again, it's another spillover example. Once Ford had figured out how to build a large integrated factory with replacement parts, that was the kind of the key thing, rather than artisans all working around on Ford cars. Everybody else figured out the same way of doing it, and then guess what? Mass production became pretty much unified. So I mean, it's a perfect example in some sense of spillovers. But back then there was much less design, much less R&D, all those kind of things. Certainly there wasn't any software and so forth, and not so many databases. So maybe there's a sense in which the the IT revolution, has pushed a lot of this stuff along as well. So, and as we saw with the examples of Roundtree, people have known about branding for a long time as well. On the other hand, I think now companies have been able to scale up massively on the branding side as well. So again, Yorkshire Tea, who we were talking about earlier on, have always had the brand Yorkshire Tea, for 40 odd years. They've done extremely well on that and managed to scale it up. So I think there's been some of these growths. There has been a growth in these things. A lot of it is probably IT related.
The gentleman here, yes, you're next.
Thank you. I was going to ask a similar question. I'm just wondering to what extent the old industries that you described initially had in-house all the intangible capital activity, which is very similar to the previous question. And I think Ken Dixon and I have had lots of conversations about how After 8 was created, and there was a huge amount of chemistry involved in doing that and experimentation. Yeah. And now you might have an external firm doing a lot of that activity, but at that time it was all in-house. So I'm just wondering, to what extent is the main difference that's occurring is not between tangible capital and intangible capital, but who's doing it. Take Uber, for example. You could say that every one of the Uber drivers is an individual taxi company. It's just that they're coordinating their activities. So I think, I think the interesting question is, to what extent is this really new, or is it just a different way of organising firms and businesses?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think it's probably an element of that. I suspect, though, many firms, like Roundtree's, want to keep this intangible stuff in-house, precisely otherwise it would spill over. So maybe part of it is, we've worked out intellectual property rights in a more sophisticated way, so that they can be more readily outsourced outside the boundaries of the factory than they could be before. But I still think that at least the data indicates, that we would have had, the data indicates this rise in intangible spend. If it was all in-house before, it would have to have been that we were just kind of completely missing it before because it was all performed in-house, which is possible, I suppose, because it is very difficult to measure this in-house stuff. But it's possible. I think unlikely, but I think it would be possible.
Right, we have someone here.
Hi, thanks. I'm a PP student here. So I've been doing a lot of research on Amazon at the moment because you've got this big fourth thing coming up with their various companies. I'm wondering whether intangible assets lend themselves better to monopoly capitalism than tangible assets, and to what extent you think monopoly capitalism is a phenomenon that's increasingly prevalent in our society.
Well, I think, as I say, at first blush, I'm probably not going to use the word monopoly capitalism right, so you come back if I get this wrong. At first blush, you'd think that these firms who can scale up, like Amazon, for example, or like Uber that Mike was mentioning earlier on, you'd think that they would scale up and they would become monopolies, if you sort of see what I mean. And that's the sense in which this part of capitalism's kind of sort of plethora of assets gives rise to those types of monopolies. I say I may not be using monopoly capitalism quite the way you mean, but let me try that as a sort of thought. What then is surprising, as I was saying to the gentleman earlier on, what is sort of surprising is if there are these spillover aspects, why other people can't do it. So part of the secret of Amazon, as I understand it, is the software that they use to monitor the workers who are working around and optimize their routes as they sort out the packing and all that kind of stuff. Well, you might ask yourself, well, why can't other companies write that software as well? Why can't, especially as Mike was asking his question, if they outsource the writing of the software, that software company could conceivably go and sell a variant of it someplace else. Why can't Ocado figure all that out with some clever machine? So at the moment, it seems like the forces towards inequality seem to be winning, but maybe those spillover types of forces which push you towards more equality, maybe in the future, they might win out some more. So I mean, a fascinating company to look at, and maybe this lens is a helpful lens to view them through. I don't know.
In the middle.
I was wondering if you're a proponent of introducing a land value tax as a way to account for the intangible assets in the property market, and also to address the inequality that might introduce.
I need to look at Juliet now. Now that I work for the monetary authorities, I'm not allowed to say anything about fiscal policy. So I think your question is a fiscal policy question. Is that right? So, but can I just emphasise so it's a great question, and that's a really horrible ducking out answer. But can I say, in a sense, just to repeat, if this is helpful, what's kind of interesting, I think, about these intangible type economies is they show up in very tangible asset prices, as your question indicates. That is to say, if everybody wants to live in cities to get these synergies and get the benefits of intangible spillovers, that just boosts tangible asset prices. So I think that's the connection.
I'll take two more questions, then we need to wind up. So the lady there and the gentleman over there.
I was going to ask about the risks regarding these intangible assets. If you're investing, for example, in a brand, and the brand goes toxic because of association with a serial killer, for example. Mind you, that could go both ways. But can you insure against this, like you can insure against your factory burning down? Is this a risk that can be managed?
Yeah, so that's a whole series of great questions around how this interacts with the financial system. For example, can you buy insurance, as you say? Or put it on the other side, if I'm a company and I've written some piece of software or a new Harry Potter script or something like that, can I go to a bank and raise some money against that? And the answer is probably not. Whereas if I go with a piece of equipment or some tangible stuff, I probably can. So I think there's a whole set of really tricky questions for the financial system about whether the financial system is well suited to this type of economy. And I think we provisionally take the view that it isn't, and that's why you see things like venture capitalists and that kind of thing. That's why there may be some more role for, sort of state intervention around science and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean that as I say, again, it's the sort of the sunkenness of this which raises that whole set of issues. So yeah.
I work in manufacturing, and we've just been taken over by this month actually by a larger company, primarily for our intangible assets actually.
Oh, yes.
So that's a matter of interest. But the question is, why do you believe that you need a tangible place like a city when the guy in Ambridge can easily connect digitally to someone in New Delhi or Beijing or wherever within seconds?
Another great question. I mean, this is a puzzle. People have been predicting the death of distance for years now, and we've been assured by scientists that we can, as you say, we can video with people on the other side of the road and other side of the world and all that kind of thing. And I think it is just a genuine puzzle why it is that hasn't happened, and therefore there does seem to be an enduring advantage. But maybe in a sense it's actually quite hopeful. Maybe in a sense it's the kind of very human interaction is something that we get more out of, and maybe, if I can say, maybe coming to this lecture exemplifies all of that, because everybody could have watched it on the video or done it on Twitter or something like that. I hope it's been a different experience actually coming here together. So maybe that human aspect of it is a kind of a hopeful element behind what would otherwise become a very anonymous kind of world.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a great place to bring things to a close, and we didn't script that. It's been a really intriguing session. I hope you'll all agree. I know there are people in this audience who think a lot about economics. They also think a lot about politics. They think about environmental change. They think about global warming. And if you think of the world we now live in, bringing in the ideas you've talked about into that bigger picture is something that we all need to do more often. We need to communicate better with each other. And I've just been given a prompt down here by my colleague to say that the Festival of Ideas, which is based in the university, starts on the 4th of June, and on the 8th of June we've got a day debating about what have the universities done for us. And there's a very distinguished list of speakers, so if you've enjoyed what you've heard tonight, you'd like to hear more, then come along and find out about what the universities have done for us. But to conclude, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been really great. I'm sure everybody would like to join me in thanking you, and perhaps come and buy your book afterwards in the atrium.
Yeah, definitely.
But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.